Welcome to the next in a series of interviews we're conducting with researchers from RTPI accredited planning schools about the various projects they're involved in and why they're important to the planning profession. This episode features Philipp Horn, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Sheffield. Philip will be discussing the research project entitled Indigenous Development Alternatives, an Urban Youth Perspective from Bolivia. The research examines the lived experiences of Indigenous youths in different urban contexts in Bolivia and the inequalities they face on a daily basis. Philip was good enough to answer a few questions that I hope will help us understand a bit more about the project and its importance to the planning profession and to wider society. Now, the questions appear in writing throughout the interview, followed by Philip's verbal responses. And for further information about this project, please visit the RTPI's Planning Research Matters Hub or email research@rtpi.org.uk.
Indigenous peoples in Bolivia and elsewhere in Latin America, they're oftentimes portrayed as living in isolated rural areas. And whilst this might be true to a certain degree, there's also something that we're missing with this representation, because many indigenous peoples actually live in cities and they lead very modern lives, like most of us. And I argue in my work that this misrepresentation of indigenous peoples as the protectors of the forest, as the people who live in the countryside, is actually a colonial misrepresentation. So, first of all, before the arrival of the colonizers, indigenous peoples lived in large urban civilizations. Many of you will have heard about Machu Picchu, or Cusco, or Tiwanaku, and these were really indigenous civilizations. And when the colonizers arrived after 1492, they destroyed most of these settlements. And on the top of their ruins, they decided to build new cities that served to administer the colonies. So these new towns were planned according to Spanish and Portuguese planning standards at the time. And crucially, these planning standards were very much guided by racial divisions. So the city was considered to be the home of the, in quote, white colonizers. And the people who lived there were granted with citizenship rights, a plot of land, housing, and services. But indigenous peoples were very much excluded from urban spaces and instead confined to living in the countryside, where they oftentimes worked and lived in rather precarious conditions. And they were also denied citizenship rights. So it's worthwhile mentioning that this was sort of the dominant mechanism at that time, but these rural-urban divisions could, of course, never really be sustained. So in the first place, indigenous peoples oftentimes served as forced labor force to build the colonial cities. And when they engaged in these kind of practices of constructing buildings, they had to live somewhere. And they did this oftentimes by living in the unplanned settlements of the urban periphery of the colonial city. And later in the post-colonial period, when the colonizers departed, there were also a series of reforms, whereby, for example, indigenous peoples received land rights in the countryside, but also the right to move freely from place to place. And accompanied by agricultural decline, climate change, and industrialization, it meant that especially in the 20th century, indigenous peoples increasingly moved to the city, or the city arrived on their lands. Because, as you know, 70% of Latin Americans live in urban centers. So that meant that cities really expanded massively in the 20th and 21st century, absorbing, among others, indigenous territories. So by 2020, more than half of Bolivia's indigenous population lived in urban areas. And in some cities, like the second largest city of El Alto, almost everyone would identify as belonging to the indigenous Aymara nation. And what I find particularly interesting is that the majority of indigenous urban dwellers are actually aged between 16 and 30. And not much is known about their living conditions, their priorities and needs, and what they think would make for a good future. So throughout the last years, I've therefore been working collaboratively with young indigenous urban residents in different parts of Bolivia. And in this project that I've been doing, indigenous youth took on the role of co-researchers. And together we explored their problems, their planning alternatives that they're putting forward, and their ideas on how to improve their own living conditions. A key finding of this work is that it's actually not sufficient for planners to look purely at rural or urban spaces to understand indigenous youth lives. Instead, we need to look at spaces in a more integrated way. I found that indigenous youths lead what I call multi-local and multi-active lives to sustain a living. And many of us do this, especially throughout the pandemic. We've been working from home. Nowadays, we have a hybrid working environment. We go back into our offices, but we might also have a second home. Not all of us, I certainly don't. But indigenous youth lead these kind of multi-local lives for different reasons. So first of all, many of them came to the city in the first place because they wanted to access better education, healthcare, and find stable employment, something they couldn't really achieve in the countryside. But when they arrived in the city, they realized that reality is also harsh there. They had to confront discrimination. They were oftentimes denied from accessing formal jobs. And crucially, they're also denied from specific indigenous rights to intercultural education or to collective land rights. So as a consequence, many of them work informally, for example, as domestic workers, as street vendors, or in the construction sector. And these jobs don't really generate an income that's sufficient. So in a context where they lack economic opportunities, but also are denied from their indigenous rights, they oftentimes mention to me that as young people, we need to maintain a foot in multiple places. So many of them then keep strong ties with their rural communities of origin. They go there at different times of the years to provide a hand, for example, in the harvest season, but also in other economic activities. And the countryside and the rural communities are also important cultural nodes for them to maintain their languages and traditions, for example, by engaging in local festivities. And many of the indigenous youth I'm working with tell me that this is nothing new. They tell me we've always led multi-local lives. And our ancestors, just like us, hold a foot in the city and a foot in the countryside simply to make ends meet. The problem, in my opinion, is then that planners and decision makers in Bolivia don't really acknowledge and address this issue of multi-locality in their interventions. And there's a need to address this problem in a more inclusive way. Let me briefly reflect on two key areas of conflict and ways forward to achieve changes that I at least think are more inclusive and respond to the needs and priorities of indigenous youth and indigenous people in general, and especially of those who are living in cities. So firstly, I think there's a real need for planning to move beyond its colonial cultures. So what do I mean by this? Colonial cultures of planning. My work in Bolivia shows that patterns of discrimination and exclusion towards indigenous peoples must really be understood as ongoing legacy of colonial planning. And again, this is probably nothing unique to Bolivia. And I think it's relevant also for UK planners. As we're living in a post-colonial society here, we might want to think about what colonial legacies exist in our cities and what can be done about this. So let me unpack a bit, what do I mean by the colonial cultures of planning in Bolivia? So for example, local authorities, including spatial planners, continue to refer to cities as non-indigenous spaces. And as I've already mentioned, this simply isn't the truth. Indigenous peoples always lived in cities. Let me give you one example from an interview I did with Bolivia's Minister of Decolonization, who told me, and I quote, "In cities where modernity has arrived, we apply universal rights, whereby in the countryside, we apply indigenous rights." End of quote. So you see, ironically, and coming from the Minister of Decolonization, this interview actually reproduces colonial understandings of cities as modern and non-indigenous spaces. And such understandings, crucially, also shape planning practices. So there's still this weird division, which is, I argue, artificial, especially because they contradict and stand in conflict with indigenous people's own claims for land. So unsurprisingly, indigenous peoples consider themselves as owners of all the lands in Bolivia and in Latin America. They're the original inhabitants, and their lands have been taken away from them historically. So for this reason, they advocate for land rights and also for the application of collective land management models in cities. in such a way that this aligns with their culture and traditions. So a crucial change required from my perspective is at least to introduce planning mechanisms that allow for the coexistence of Western individual land rights modules and collective indigenous land use planning models. And my research points out some ways forward for the Bolivian context. And again, I'd provoke planners also in the UK to think about these questions here. What are the colonial cultures of planning and what can be done about it? And now let me reflect on a second conflict, which links back to these multi-local lives that I've already talked about. So in many ways, national and local government authorities in Bolivia and elsewhere don't capture this. So Bolivia's population census, for example, only records a residence location during survey collection. So this means if you're in the city, that's where you're registered. But your secondary home in the countryside is simply not accounted for. So this makes this other part of one's person's life invisible. And I think this has important implications, especially for planning and local governance, especially in Bolivia, because their census results essentially determine the allocation of financial resources, but also of local government responsibilities. So this means in practice that people who registered for the census in cities cannot access services like education when they're away from their urban home to engage in agricultural activities in the countryside. Meanwhile, because indigenous rights are ignored in cities, these people can't access indigenous rights to land or education in these settings. So I really think that some simple changes are at hand to help addressing this problem. So for example, in the census, but also in resource allocation mechanisms, it would be good to take into consideration questions around multiple residences and activities. And rural and urban planning regimes could be integrated under a regional planning approach and a governance framework that connects distinct municipalities and rights frameworks, as I've already highlighted before. And again, this would then mean that indigenous rights to tenure, intercultural education, and justice could simply be applied wherever indigenous peoples live, including and especially in cities. Now I would actually reflect on another area which I think is key in terms of changing the way we conceive and generate planning knowledge and the way we communicate and represent this knowledge as well. So indigenous communities, including the youth groups I'm working with, highlight that they want to be involved in planning. They say anything that affects us should involve us. And what I've found out is that this is not just simply a call for planning to be more collaborative and participatory, but it's also a call for doing planning differently, for questioning what planning knowledge is, how it should be produced, and how it should be presented. So in regards to presentation, my indigenous co-researchers say that they dislike planning documents, especially those that are composed of maps and text. So this sounds a bit strange. This is what planners do. But for the people I'm working with, maps are associated with colonial strategies of dividing their territories precisely through the mechanisms of planning, such as zoning or the creation of frontiers and boundaries. Written text, on the other hand, they consider to be exclusive, because until the present, it's oftentimes written in Spanish, which is conceived of as the colonial language. And it uses terminology that is hardly accessible to people living in local communities. So to overcome this problem, I'd argue it is important to generate and represent planning knowledge differently. And this needs to be done in a more culturally appropriate way. So in the project I'm currently working on, we've tried to do precisely this. We deployed a methodological approach that puts indigenous knowledge and priorities into the center stage from beginning to the end. So to do this, we've discussed with our co-researchers what they actually want to capture and how they want to capture this, and what outputs are required for them to do this. So as a consequence, we've produced a series of multimedia representations, an illustrative book that contains photos, graphic visuals, accompanied also with a bit of text, but written in a more locally accessible way, and a film that combines documentary and fiction. Why fiction? Because our co-researchers highlighted that certain things they experience, like racism or discrimination, cannot easily be documented. They require an acting, they require different forms of representation. Filming, in the case of our project, focused on our indigenous co-researchers acting out their own and others' lives in front of the camera. And for them, this actually was more than just documenting something. It aligned neatly with what famous planning scholar Leonie Sandercook refers to as therapeutic planning. It enabled them to actually create a space for the unspeakable, to talk about their fears, their hopes, and ideas of transforming the world in such a way that aligns with their own priorities. It allowed them to tell their own stories in their own way and to imagine their futures otherwise. And I think it's precisely this future-making potential of film that aligns with a core principle of our discipline, the future orientation of planning. As planners, we are following a goal of making places better to live, work, and spend our free time in. And in order to do this, in order to represent this in such a way that it aligns with the needs of people with whom we're working, we need to also deploy methods and develop outputs that align with their needs. So more attention, I'd argue, should be paid towards filming and other creative ways of doing planning and of representing planning in such a way that it can be shared with others to collaboratively build and discuss pathways for more inclusive, just, and culturally diverse cities.